Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our second webinar on the revolutionary FAR overhaul. My name is Michael Thompson, and I support GSA Senior Procurement Executive Jeff Kosis and his team working on the ongoing rewrite of the Federal Acquisition Regulation. As a preliminary matter, I want to make sure everyone is aware that today's meeting is being recorded. The slides and the recording of this session will be posted on gsa.gov. Let me repeat, the slides will be posted on gsa.gov, and the link to that page will be shared in the chat several times over the course of this session. Please note that attendees cannot post messages in the chat or use the questions function. Back in May, during our first webinar, we introduced you to Executive Order 14275, Restoring Common Sense to Federal Procurement, which directed a rewrite of the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The FAR Council has seized this opportunity to streamline and simplify the acquisition process. VO says to rewrite the FAR by stripping the current FAR of non-statutory requirements and making similar changes to agency supplements, including GSA's General Services Acquisition Manual, or GSA. These changes are to be made now, implemented via deviations. Through the rewrite, GSA and our colleagues at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, OFPP, and the FAR Council have worked the past months to simplify and streamline the FAR, and, as of last Thursday, have published rewrites of 31 parts, not counting parts 2 and 52. As we mentioned in May, the FAR rewrite is more comprehensive than just the rewrite of the FAR regulation itself. OMB, via its implementation memo, created the Strategic Acquisition Guidance Framework, or SAG. The SAG includes both regulatory resources, specifically the FAR and agency supplements, and non-regulatory acquisition guides. Initially, two non-regulatory guides are envisioned, the FAR Companion and the Category Management Buying Guide. The FAR Companion is hot off the press, just released yesterday on acquisition.gov. Aligned to FAR parts and designed to operationalize the new FAR and strengthen adoption of proven acquisition best practices, the FAR Companion is designed to empower the acquisition workforce to determine which practices are suitable for each situation, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. Some of this advice in the FAR Companion is advice that was formerly prescriptive in the FAR, and some of it stems from proven innovative practice. The FAR Companion provides advice, not direction. This builds the confidence of the acquisition workforce to take managed risk. Having that discretion is important. Now, the Category Management Buying Guide, which is in development, is intended to help practitioners effectively navigate buying pathways aligned to category management. Think of it as a government-wide solutions finder. In addition to the FAR Companion and the Category Buying Guide, we've also created practitioner albums. And today, we will also highlight those practitioner albums, which you've likely already seen on acquisition.gov. The practitioner albums serve as pivotal, immediate learning assets to help the acquisition community navigate the SAG and the FAR as it is rewritten. Practitioner albums provide the change summary and the line out for each deviated FAR part, as well as highlight best practices. Some practitioner albums also contain what we call smart accelerators. These are bite-sized learning assets designed to provide practical guidance on specific changes or concepts within each FAR deviation. Now, I'd like to take a moment to set the stage for what this webinar will cover. This webinar will focus on the commercial tranche of the FAR deviations that were published a few weeks ago. That's FAR Parts 4, 8, 12, and 40. We'll go through each part individually. So in a few moments, James Sujimoto will deliver a presentation on the FAR Part 4 model deviation, followed by Monica Taylor with a presentation on the corresponding FAR Companion and Practitioner album. We will then answer your pre-collected questions about FAR Part 4. Then we will rinse and repeat with FAR Parts 8, including a brief touch on FAR Parts 38 and 51, FAR Part 12, and FAR Part 40. Thank you for submitting those questions in advance. They were informative in preparing for this session. Please note that we do not have enough time today to address all of the questions you've already sent in, but we will definitely hit a lot of the common themes. Because of the robust number of pre-collected questions, we will not have a live Q&A session. Instead, we will focus on your already submitted questions. Now, finally, after we've gone through those four FAR parts, Jeff Kosis, the GSA Senior Procurement Executive, will provide some summary remarks and takeaways, and will tell us about the training that we are already offering our acquisition workforce. Then I'll ask Jeff a few of your questions as well before closing us out. So again, we will post the slides and the recording of this session as soon as possible on gsa.gov. But now, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon. My name is James Sujimoto. I serve under the GSA Procurement Management Review Division, where I primarily work with our agency acquisition data. I'm going to walk through some of the changes implemented by the RFO in FAR Part 4, Administrative and Information Matters. We've started with Part 4 since it really sets the groundwork for several of the other updates that we'll be talking about today. As a quick reminder for those who don't have the FAR memorized, Part 4 deals with everything from registration requirements for entities to receive contracts through the System for Award Management, SAM.gov, to contract file documentation requirements for the government, to contract closeout procedures, and much, much more. FAR Part 4 has been reorganized within each subpart to better follow the acquisition process, such as identifying the steps to take before solicitation versus after award. This new structure makes it easier and faster to find needed information at each stage of the procurement. We hope that both contracting professionals and our industry partners find this to be a beneficial change. Additionally, the overhauled FAR Part 4 reduces 13 of the provisions and clauses required by the part down to just 7. Some of those provisions and clauses were entirely removed, while others were reimagined in consolidated updates. Lastly, the policy envisions reduced SAM registration requirements for easier navigation and registration by our industry partners. Once implemented in the system, we expect the policy to reduce GSA's cost to operate SAM on the back end, while simultaneously alleviating some of the registration burden from our vendors. This restructure will follow one of two paths depending upon if SAM registration will be required or not. Now let's go through some of those changes, namely what has been added, changed, or removed from the FAR Part 4 as part of this overhaul. Much has changed through the RFO process. This overview is intended only as an overview of what has changed, and we encourage you to directly review the RFO Part 4 and related materials. So what's new? Some entirely new content has been added, such as the explicit authorization of digital signatures within the FAR. Additionally, throughout the RFO deviation, the language used has been revised to be more streamlined and consistent. Additionally, as I alluded to earlier, many of the clauses that previously existed within FAR Part 4 have been consolidated into greatly simplified versions. Now, let's move over to what has moved. We have both content that is moved to a different FAR part and content that is moved within FAR Part 4. Several subparts from Part 4 have been relocated to RFO FAR Part 40. This includes the subparts on information security and supply chain security management. Additionally, several related FAR Part 4 provisions and clauses have been removed and incorporated into the RFO Part 40 as well. My colleague Kevin will cover these updates in much greater detail later in the session. Many recommendations and best practices that were formerly found in FAR Part 4 have been moved out of FAR Part 4 and into the FAR Companion Guide that Michael mentioned earlier. My colleague Monica will cover that resource as she takes you through the available practitioner resources in just a bit. In addition to the content updates, several subparts have shifted within FAR Part 4 as part of the overhaul. You'll find new homes for subparts on contract reporting, common access cards, otherwise known as PIV or PIV cards, and the returns required with those, as well as information on submitting information for the service contract inventory and the executive compensation requirements found within the FAR. Finally, let's talk about what was removed. Some subparts have been entirely removed or relocated to more appropriate overhauled sections. For example, the information on contract distribution has been moved from FAR subpart 4.2 to FAR subpart 4.307, just a little bit further down. Notably, the update to contract distribution now removes an outdated requirement for paper contract distributions. Lastly, we have entirely removed clauses on the two clauses on the approval of contracts and the alternative line item proposals, as these clauses are now obsolete. Collectively, these changes will help the federal government shed some of the burdens of yesteryear and move into the future. Now, Please allow me to let my colleague Monica tell you a little bit more about the practitioner resources designed to help contracting professionals with the transition.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon. I'm Monica Taylor, a Senior Innovation Coach detailed to the GSA Office of Government-Wide Policy to support the revolutionary FAR Overhaul Practitioner Workstream. Now, I'm going to tell you I'm very excited to be here today to cover some of the non-regulatory resources available to practitioners, but also made available to you, our industry partners. To really understand the purpose and the intent of the non-regulatory resources, I'll be covering both the FAR Companion, as Jay said, and the Practitioner albums for the applicable FAR parts discussed. So you're going to see me a few times today. One of the items that was removed from FAR Part 4, Administrative and Information Matters, and mentioned in the summary of changes was the content of contract files. Now, this wasn't statutory, but something that is a best practice, but there isn't always a one-size-fits-all approach. And so depending on the complexity of the file, the contract type, what you're buying, etc., one of the things that you'll see on the screen is a highlight from the FAR Companion, as Michael said, hot off the press. Contract files should be complete yet tailored to the specific acquisition. And so in this, we are empowering the workforce while understanding that a lot of our contract systems were built around this content. All right. And so although it wasn't statutory, this is something that was a best practice to consider and with that ability for discretion. And so this provides a common baseline for all agencies to follow. And so the consistency is also crucial for system providers. Some of you may be system providers out there, ensuring they have a clear understanding, and there's a clear understanding of the essential contract file documentation requirements when developing and implementing acquisition systems. Another item you'll see on the screen that was also in the FAR Companion, low-risk contract closeout. And you'll see in that highlight that at least one agency developed and used what was referred to as a low-risk closeout procedures for a specific type of expired contracts. And this is another area of empowerment and flexibility. And so the revolutionary aspect in the model deviation text of FAR subpart 1.102A7 and 1.102B4, contracting officers now have maximum authority to determine how and when to apply rules, and teams can assume that they're allowed to use any strategy not addressed in the FAR nor prohibited by law. And so that FAR 1 rewrite emphasized this in plain language. And this is a dramatic departure from the traditional, if it's not explicitly permitted, it's forbidden mindset. So with that, nothing prohibits the use of low-risk contract closeout in this method. And so as we dive into the Practitioner album, hopefully you'll see how this was conveyed to the acquisition workforce as a resource with a real use case. And so ultimately what we want to do is streamline and reduce the administrative burden so the practitioner can focus on collaborating and innovating with our industry partners. So we're going to segue into the Practitioner album for FAR Part 4. Now, James covered the change summary, which is the first track of each Practitioner album. Really encourage you to look at that change summary. It provides the high-level summary of important updates to the FAR text. It also shares what was retained in the FAR and removed from the FAR. And it was either, lets you know if it was either addressed in non-regulatory resources, or maybe it was deleted because the content was outdated, redundant, or otherwise unnecessary. So for example, hopefully you're listening, James mentioned subparts that were relocated from FAR Part 4 to FAR Part 40, and that's covered in the Practitioner album change summary. And so this change summary is coordinated with the FAR analysts and leads. Now, the Practitioner albums also provide the line out of the old FAR text, but it's very important and critical to read this in conjunction with the new model deviation text. The Practitioner albums offer ready-made, tested tools, best practices, and resources to implement and share feedback on the benefits and challenges associated with the new Strategic Acquisition Guidance, the SAG. So for FAR Part 4, the Smart Accelerators provided a few best practices to maximizing contract files and strategies for faster contract closeouts. Another Smart Accelerator that you would have seen in FAR Part 4 album, bulk contract closeout. Low risk contract closeout was framed in there. And so it shared with the practitioners potential considerations to determine which contracts are a good fit for faster closeout processing. And there was also a host of resources for contract closeout and leveraging automation for that as well, and real use cases across the federal government. Last but not least, James covered the SAM.gov changes. In the FAR Part 4 Practitioner album, there is also a track on the album that provides information and a PDF handout that provides the further detail on the impact, the harmful impacts to SAM.gov. And so this resource, it provides an explanation of the changes, the rationale for the changes, and the anticipated benefits of the changes. Ultimately, the intent of the SAM.gov changes are reduced administrative burden and fewer requests to update company information in SAM.gov once procurement-specific representations and certifications are moved to the individual solicitations. That concludes my section for FAR Part 4, and I'll turn it back over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, James. That was very informative. As I mentioned, we have some questions pre-submitted by industry. Again, industry, thank you so much for sending them in. So James, I'm going to start with you. With Part 4, there were some changes to the System for Award Management, or SAM. When will the changes be implemented in SAM?
Great question. SAM.gov system changes are not anticipated to occur until at least January 2026 at the earliest. To stay plugged into the latest SAM.gov updates and what might be coming down the pipeline, please join GSA Interact, and you can join by visiting buy.gsa.gov. That's buy.gsa.gov.
Thanks, James. Now, Monica, back to you. Thanks for introducing us to the FAR Companion for FAR Part 4, and I'm sure we'll hear about the FAR Companion when we get to some of the other parts as well. But it, along with the other non-regulatory resources, seems so valuable, but what will encourage agencies to adopt these practices and truly depart from business as usual?
That's a great question, Michael. And I'm going to say again, I'm really excited to see the FAR Companion release, and we're really looking forward to that feedback. But the FAR Council developed that FAR Companion to help acquisition officials exercise their discretion. That's really important. But the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, OFPP, will work with agencies to reduce the proliferation of disparate agency-level guidance and tools that duplicate coverage in the FAR Companion. And so the FAR Companion will work in concert with the FAR, agency supplements, and the Category Management Buying Guide as the foundation for the new Strategic Acquisition Guidance Framework. So these resources, these non-regulatory resources, regulatory, non-regulatory, along with the Practitioner album's tested learning tools for better contract outcomes, continued investment in workforce development, coaching support, collaborative learning experiences, and technology-enabled tools will really ease the transition from that rigid compliance to judgment-based procurement practices and enable mission success through more timely, less costly, and more competitive buying that modern federal acquisition demands. So this is just the beginning.
Thanks, Monica. I've got a couple more questions for you. They're a little more general, not necessarily about FAR Part 4, but since you just introduced us to these non-regulatory pieces of guidance and helpful information, I wanted to ask some of these. So you've talked about how the whole changes are supposed to empower contracting officers to take more risks. Is this only when acquiring major systems, or is this shift broader than that?
Yeah, so while empowering contracting officers to take more smart risks, we want those risks to be smart, it's certainly relative to major system acquisitions. The intent of the revolutionary FAR overhaul extends beyond these high-profile projects, right? There's always opportunity to streamline. And so the goal is to foster a culture of innovation and adaptability across all areas of government contracting. And so this does involve encouraging the contracting officers, the entire team to explore new technologies, contract types, acquisition strategies, while also ensuring appropriate oversight and accountability to manage the associated risks effectively.
Thanks, Monica. I've got another question for you about these resources. That's the word I couldn't think of before, these non-regulatory resources. How do the periodic table of acquisition innovations and the FAR deviations and these non-regulatory resources all work together? What happens if a technique in the FAR companion or in a practitioner album affects a technique that's already in the PTAI?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to actually be sharing a little bit more about the PTAI little later today, but the Revolutionary Fire Overhaul, the RFO, and the PTAI, that periodic table of acquisition innovations, are complementary. And so the RFO aims to empower contracting officers to be more innovative and adaptable. And the periodic table of acquisition innovations is a tool that can help them identify and implement those innovations. So in fact, and you'll see maybe some of you already have that FAR companion printed out next to you, but the RFO actually enhances the applicability of the PTAI, as many of the techniques are now directly incorporated into the FAR companion. So while the RFO may update or streamline certain acquisition processes, the fundamental principles and techniques outlined in the PTAI will remain a valuable resource, all right, for driving innovation in government contracting. In fact, we actually expect the new FAR to enable acquisition teams to develop additional innovative approaches to contracting. And if you have an innovation that you'd love to be considered right now, you can actually submit that on the PTAI today after this meeting. But in time, it will add it to the PTAI and FAR companion.
Thanks, Monica. Feel free to take a breath. This next question is for James. James, where can people go to learn about all of these changes?
Another great question. This advice probably applies to all of the FAR parts that we're going to review today, but acquisition.gov is the place to go. Acquisition.gov hosts the latest RFO updates, and that content can be found using the hyperlinks up at the top of the page. That same link provides further options to more resources such as the FAR Practitioner album, FAQs, and the FAR companion.
Thank you, James. Now, as a reminder, we were talking about FAR Part 4. So, Monica, I do have a FAR Part 4 specific question for you. A large section of FAR Part 4 was moved to the FAR companion, specifically contents of contract files. Why did that content move?
Great question again. And so the decision to move the section of contents for the contract files from the FAR to the FAR companion guide, Part 4, was really driven by several key considerations. Primarily, it was about removing the prescriptive non-regulatory requirements from the FAR to allow for more efficient updates as best practices evolve and acquisition systems modernize. Right. And so this movement allows for greater agility and adapting to new technologies and processes. We know that technology moves fast, right? And so beyond that, it was deemed important to maintain government-wide consistency in contract file documentation. And so this FAR companion, it gives that opportunity to do as such. And so by including that information in the FAR companion, it provides a common baseline for all agencies to follow. And so this consistency was just really crucial for, as I said earlier, for system providers, ensuring that industry, whoever is involved in creating the systems, have a clear understanding of essential contract file documentation requirements when developing and implementing the acquisition system. So all of those that touch that acquisition lifecycle and touch those acquisition systems and contract files.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Monica. We're going to turn to FAR Part 8 now.